I'm just running a few times a little video here from a flood in Czech Republic some 20 years ago or so, where they filmed some of the consequences of flooding, which will be the first topic today. Here's a house going. I think it cost around $1 billion in losses, all in all, this particular flood.
No loss of life, I guess.
Very few. I mean, I think there were a few old people who in remote areas, but it was very few. Right. So, should we just get going? I'm not gonna show this one. Yeah. So what I'll do today, this morning, is first talk about flood risk management, so flooding as such, and then shift to drought and introduce this flood and drought monitor portal, and then we'll go and work with that. But starting with the flooding. Here's actually another one from Australia. Just a private person being at the spot and filming this with his phone, as far as I know. So as you can see, just water going down the road and hitting cars and others. I'm sure YouTube is absolutely full of videos of this type. Yeah, we're getting there. So there's always been lots of flooding, but if you look at some of recent years, Eastern Australia was quite badly hit in these 2 years in different locations. In Queensland, in Brisbane was very bad in 2011, and that was actually following, I think, 7-8 years of drought. They had really had, all the reservoirs were very low and so on, which was in a way good because then at least they could catch some of the water. But still, the flooding turned out to be very bad. New South Wales, Victoria had others. Yeah, some fatalities, a lot of people affected, and what have we got here? $5.6 billion damage, and a lot of GDP lost also. This was then related to unusual weather patterns and the strongest La Nina for a long time. Right? And I mean, this El Nino and La Nina has been there probably forever, at least as far as we know, right? So here comes the strongest for 100 years. And of course you then think climate change, and you may very well be right, but again, because of this huge variation in the weather from year to year, it's very difficult statistically to actually prove this is, now we're seeing the climate change. Right? It's a global problem, as you know, and something that people have been dealing with for thousands of years. Flooding is on every continent except Antarctica, as far as we know. The number of catastrophic storms and floods have more than doubled in the last 30 years, according to Munich Re. This is, again, you should think climate change, but Munich Re is a reinsurance company, and they look at the money. And what they look at here is what are the costs of the floods? So what's the damage losses? Right? And that is what has increased like this. So a great part of the explanation is likely that there is so much more to destroy when the flood comes. With higher population, more people move into the floodplains. There's been no flood for 5 years, you feel safe, you start building a lot of expensive houses and other things that are then washed away. Right? So looking at statistics, flooding is by far the most common of the natural disasters. So we have floods here, we have, this must be heavy storms, earthquakes, extreme temperatures, there are landslides, drought, wildfire, volcanic activity. So in number, floods are the most common. Floods also affect more people than other natural disasters. So being number one here, the second here is drought, and the third is storms. So a lot of people are affected. But if you look at fatalities, it's number 3. So here the storms are the worst ones. Then extreme temperature, and then comes floods. Probably partly because of warning, which is in place in many countries. And then many floods also come rather slowly, so you can get away. We are working in Malawi at the moment along the Shira River that maybe some of you started the exercise. In the lower part, there was a flood in 2015. And this was actually coming quite slowly, because this is a rather flat area, so it was moving out rather slowly. But I met a young guy from a village down there, and he was telling that he had, everybody had noticed that the river was now approaching their village. So, and it was turning dark, and he then asked he and his friends asked the older people, shouldn't we do something? The water's coming. And they said, no, it never floods in January. I mean, floods is February, March, it never floods in January. 5 people died in that village, because they were lying there at night, and probably the village was in a shallow area. So once it started spilling over, maybe some of the old people were unable to get away. Right? So, right. Flood is different from other disasters, that what we write here is they're preventable. Well, not fully, but still you can take some action, right? You can at least reduce floods. You can plan for floods, and you can forecast floods. So looking at some of the fatalities and damage of the last 20 years, this 2011 flood in Thailand was the highest single economic loss up to 2011, $40 billion. In Hurricane Sandy, then in the US, surpassed it by 75 billion. So compared to the 80s, fatality rates and losses generally falling, while population and infrastructure at risk have increased. Right? And the volumes show also an increasing trend. Very likely, or very possibly due to climate change, but again, statistically difficult to prove. Right? So what are the challenges? Well, adaptation to increasing risk has already paid dividend, but there are still some challenges. And one of the main ones is probably that people tend now to settle on the floodplains, as mentioned, right? Estuaries and coastal areas and so on, with buildings and others expanding like that. Transport, it's typically along the river and along coastal areas. It's flat, so it's easy to make railways and roads and so on. But then you're also close to the water, and the risk is there. Population is growing, infrastructure is expanding in these areas, mainly in developing countries. So you have this increasing exposure to floods. Land use change is also taking place. So we have the urban areas that are accelerating runoff. So if you pave the area, of course you don't. That accelerates things, and also the reduction in wetlands, which we see as development take place. Often they move into a wetland, which has a natural retention of flooding, at least minor floods, right? That also disappears then. So increasing exposure, on the land use, increasing hazard from the changing land use. Climate change is there. And will probably increase the hazard even further in the next 100 years, or even smaller periods. But intense storms, sea level rise, and so on. It'll be interesting to see in Bangladesh, where I think, is it 2/3 of the country which is below 4 meters of sea level. And you've got 150 million people in a small area, right? If the sea goes up by a meter, where are they going to be? But one thing that we are also looking into is, I mean, this is a delta, and when the river comes down to a delta, it has a lot of sediment, which then deposited. The delta is there because of sediment, right? So as the ocean goes up, flow velocities will stop earlier and maybe deposit. So it'll be a bit of a race between sea level rise and sedimentation, right? Which is the fastest? And can you do anything? Is it possible maybe to deliberately flood some areas and let the sediment and then the waters seep out afterwards? Could you sort of build up the land? My guess is it will not be fast enough. I'm guessing sea level rise is faster, but interesting to see. Anyway, So absolute protection from flooding is not possible technically, or not economically feasible, you could say. So decision making is increasingly becoming multidimensional and concerned with different conflicting objectives. So what are the solutions to flooding? Well, generally they talk about these three words, all starting with P: prevention, protection, and preparedness. And prevention, as I mentioned, is not maybe the best term because you can't prevent the flood completely, right? But you can reduce, you can limit it at least, right? What you would typically do is, and now I can't draw, but if you have a town along a river which is flood prone, and the river comes down from upstream somewhere, as you can see all this water coming down, you could maybe divert it, if there's a possibility, retain it. If you have a dam, release water from the dam beforehand and then catch as much as you can. In China, along the Yangtze River, before the Three Gorges Dam, which is now controlling to a large extent. But there, along the river, of course they have embankments, but then outside the embankments, 8-meter high embankments or so. Again, it goes down to the land, and then they have areas that are maybe some square kilometers, several square kilometers, that are also embanked in like a square, right? So you have a square there, and next to that there's another one. So they have these compartments they talk about, which are along the river, and these are reserved for flooding, basically. So they have built in dynamite in the embankments, and if the river gets too high or there's a risk for this downstream town, they blow the dynamite and let one compartment be flooded. And if that's not enough, they flood another one. Right? When they started this, nobody were living in this area. The land was used, I think, for some livestock or whatever, but people were not actually living there. But it's attractive, fertile land near the river, right? So you can't really keep people away. So after a while, they started moving in there. And they were then told, okay, you can live here, you don't have to pay for the land, but we will flood it whenever we feel it's necessary. Right? We'll try to tell you in advance. Right? I think it was in '98. There was some of these areas that were evacuated 3 times during the flood season. So they were all up standing there on the embankment and looking down at their house and whatever, but they didn't flood them because they evacuated and said we might have to, and then okay, you can go back now. So, but that's the way of doing it, because you of course destroy something. But compared to the whole town being completely flooded, it's a better option, right? So prevention is often efficient. You can have areas like that in Europe. There are polders, they call them, where even automatically may spill over and to an area which is then maybe a park, and it's known it's posted there, note that this may be flooded and occasionally, but the structure that spills over is made in such a way that it comes very slowly. So, of course, they'll try to get people out, but if they've forgotten a few, then they notice they get wet feet. Right? Okay, so prevention is there. Protection, of course, is there locally. Then in the town, that you have embankments around that, you have other local protection in the town itself. One problem with protection is that it's designed typically for, say, a 100-year flood. So a lot of people will live in that town and never see a flood, right? So then they feel safe, and and construction goes on, and more value there. And then suddenly, when the 200-year flood or the 500-year flood comes, then we have the problem. Right? Preparedness is then a cheap one, relatively, right? Prepared is a question of early warning. So you have forecasting and early warning. You have people being aware of the flood risk and having made whatever preparations you can make in areas that are flood prone, right? So you're ready for it when it happens. I'll just go back here and tell you a story. So in the Czech Republic, in that area where we saw the video, after that flood, they called DHI to help plan what to do about it. But of course, in that country, they also have a lot of organizations working, like you have here with Central Water Commission and so on, working with these issues. So all these organizations were involved, and we were involved. And this was 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union and all that. So Czech Republic had changed from a communist country to a democracy, but many of the organizations were still the same. And there were some water boards that had been there in the communist times, and then they had been constructing reservoirs and a lot of concrete everywhere, right? They were still there, and many other stakeholders, universities and so on. So when we started the project, we had a workshop with a lot of people, and they were discussing like anything. They were almost fighting. And it was mainly some people from the university who had now understood new ways of flood management. You make wetlands, you preserve nature, you work with nature rather than just putting up structures. So, and they were very much against these water boards because they had seen the water boards making all these constructions. My impression was that the people in the water boards also had understanding of new ways of doing it, but they were really, I mean, it was very intense. We didn't have an opinion, we were just the consultant from outside. But what we did then was, of course, we made models of the area and in the models we could then test things. We then asked all these stakeholders, what do you propose we do then? And some were saying, well, we could maybe make some small reservoirs up here, we could make some polders and so on. But the university, I remember, they were saying, this is a question of land use, and it's the agriculture that's the problem. Up in the countryside, we have all these farmland areas which are well drained, so the water will just drain quickly down, and then it comes out too fast. So remove the agriculture. So we asked all of it. I mean, there are all these farmers living. We just everything into forest. Let me think about it. Right. So they thought about it, and then there came a proposal of how much. I think about half the agricultural land should go back to forest, I think was the idea. And they were building artificial wetlands and so on. So we put this into models, and there were all these other suggestions and so on. And the next workshop showed the results of just these individual different measures that have been proposed. And this one about making a few wetlands and changing the agriculture. On a big flood that would go from the floor up to here, it would mean this much, right? So it wouldn't really matter. But then there's people from the university say, oh, well, okay, but then what, right? And then the dialogue slowly started with them and the water board people who were very, also tried to be as environmentally friendly as they could because to reduce the fighting. But then these people started talking together, and slowly more ideas came up, and we tried different combinations and so on. And there was a process during this project that led to several quite efficient ways of doing this. The problem was a bit that if you took this measure, it helped these people over here, but it didn't help the people here, right? If you did something else, then it was so which is the best, because there wouldn't be money for everything. How do you decide what to do? Then we got another project when we then looked at what is how much damage is reduced in relation to what is the cost of a measure. You could we were making these flood maps. I'll show a bit about flood mapping later. So we were making these maps of floods of different return periods, so 50-year flood, 100-year, 500-year flood, seeing how much it spreads out. And then you could, in the model, building these different measures, maybe a reservoir here and a polder there. Then the same flood would make a smaller inundation. And you can calculate or estimate the damage of flooding as a relation to the water depths. So if it just the floor is getting a little wet, it doesn't cost much. If we're up to a meter inside a house, well, furniture is destroyed and so on. When it gets higher, structural damage start appearing. So you can estimate these curves of flood damage as a function of level. And based on that in GIS, we then calculated what is the damage for all these floods, and based on that we can calculate in the long term what is the annual average damage over 1,000 years, say, of the flooding, right? So with that, we could then say if we implement this combination of measures, that is then at this cost, we can then reduce the damage so much. If it's this one, then we reduce it so much. And we were then only looking at what's called direct damages. When you have a flood, you may have a bridge destroyed, and for the next year, maybe, people cannot cross the river at that point. A lot of traffic, a lot of delay, it affects businesses and so on. So economists can calculate indirect damages like that. And there are also intangible damages. Then this graveyard is destroyed. So that means a lot to people, right? But it doesn't cost anything. But that's difficult to calculate. So we took only the direct damages and used that as the benefit cost. And based on that, ended up with, this is now the solution. And the good thing about it was, everybody agreed. Because these stakeholders have been involved in the process all the way, nobody doubted that. Everybody, this has been checked. The university had a lot of masters and other students looking into details and so on, right? So everybody agreed this is the way forward. And for the next 20 years, the Czech Republic invested, I don't know how much, in actually constructing what we then designed on the basin scale. Of course, then you need a detailed design where we were not involved. Right? So that was a nice process to go through, and involved prevention and protection. This was then forecasting was then set up actually later on also by somebody else. Okay. What this figure shows here is a bit the combination. So you have the flood hazard, which is basically the amount of water coming down. How much is actually, how big is the flood? A measure of that. Then there's the exposure. So what is exposed to the flooding of towns, of villages, of agricultural areas, and so on. And here we have the vulnerability of those who are exposed. So the flood, the solution to the flooding problem could be to reduce all of these three. In Europe, there was the EU decided a flood directive about 10 years ago, which ordered all the countries, you can say, to assess what the risk is from flooding and map the flood extent, and then take measures to reduce the risk as such. So generally what the countries did was, if they hadn't done already, first to make what's called the preliminary flood mapping, which is very rough, so you just get an idea where is flood at all possible. Then the areas that are then vulnerable here, a more detailed flood mapping, and based on that then some actual plans to how to reduce the risk. In Australia, it's the different states of Australia who have the responsibility, and they have carried out extensive flood mapping all over the country. In US, it's an organization called FEMA, who also does flood mapping, and including for insurance in that country.
If we just link the main highly flooded river with the drought-prone river,
Yeah.
this will be solve the problem.
I mean, if you look at overall in the world, the average amount of water that's available is fine, right? So on average, we're fine. The problem is exactly that we are flooding here and drought here. It's a bit like if you put 1 feet in ice water and 1 in boiling water, on average, you're fine. Right? But I mean, linking a drought, what you're saying is linking a river with where flooding occurs to a river where there's not enough water. The problem is a bit that I mean, the transfer might be a good idea because you get but the timing is the problem, right? Because you have the flooding over maybe a few days only, right? And the rest of the time they may want to keep the water there, right? They will like to get rid of the flood, but I'm not sure that drought areas actually want to flood. They would like a constant supply, right? So actually doing that practically is difficult, right? Very general if you look at consequences. So if you look at the likelihood of flood from small to high likelihood and low to high consequences, well then, of course, the floods that have quite high likelihood to occur frequently and have high consequences will have the highest priority. Whereas if it's a low likelihood and the consequences are not very bad, you may not be so concerned about that. You can actually divide it like this, that these risks down here you can just ignore. These can probably be mitigated just by insurance. And here a change of behavior can manage it. So it's basically up here with a relatively high likelihood and high consequences that you need to take some kind of action. So generally the flood risk is a combination of what is the probability of the flood and what are the consequences, right? Yeah, the frequency or probability of flood extent, depth, velocity, and so on is not enough to actually make the risk assessment. You need to look at these consequences as just mentioned. And if you say the probability maybe varies like this, the consequences like that, well then you have this central area which is the main risk to address. Right? With flood warning, emergency response, recovery and rehabilitation, prevention and mitigation. Yeah. So based on that, you are including these economic consequences as we did in the Czech Republic also, and looking into how much to invest also in the different measures, right? So how much in prevention, in protection, and in preparedness. So that is what I had on that, I think. And we'll go a bit more to looking into flood forecasting. We may also have some flood mapping here that I don't remember, otherwise I'll find some. But it's one of the very widely used methods, and one of the probably highly recommended is the forecasting of floods, because if you know it's coming, you have a very good chance of reducing, first of all, of course, loss of life, which should go to zero actually if it's done properly, but also reduce the losses. Munich Re at one point estimated that a proper flood warning can reduce the damage by 50%. So you can save half of the damage if you have proper warning. You can't. I mean, buildings are destroyed as we saw, but other valuables can be saved. I remember there was one flood warning in Germany that would hit a BMW factory, and they had very near the river. They had 300 cars parked, and they had another parking space just 500 meters away, which was high enough, right? So they had all the staff running out into a car, driving them up there, and they had half an hour, but they made it. So, so flood forecasting, a cost-effective way of reducing the exposure to risk. So you have hazard here, you have your exposure and the vulnerability. So flood forecasting is down here. Reduce the exposure by getting people and valuables away. Of course, using weather forecast to do that. So individuals have the possibility of moving property and themselves, of course, away from the floodwater. Emergency services can then enact whatever plans they have for emergency action in those areas. So basically, flood forecasting is a question of providing advanced predictions of what happens in the river, what are the levels, the flows, and to which extent will flooding occur. So to run this, you need models. You have your hydrological rainfall runoff models, you have hydraulic models, and they are running in real time. They're using real-time data of rainfall and forecast and weather forecast. And the important thing here is then the forecasting the amount of rainfall. How much? It's called QPF, quantitative precipitation forecast. How much rain is going to come, and in which areas and when. And that is still an area where we can improve. I mean, the meteorological models today are much better than they were, and probably keep improving, but particularly in mountain areas, to forecast that exactly in this valley you're going to have 50 millimeters of rainfall in just a few hours, you can't forecast. You can say the high risk of heavy showers, but that's about it. Right? Forecasts are typically made several times a day at maybe a few hours or up to a day interval, depending on the size of the catchment. And models keep getting this new information and running them, updating in each cycle. So it just continues like this. So here is an example where this is the forecast of a reservoir water level, and the different colored lines, like the yellow one here, is a forecast about this time, and then it forecasts the level to go be like that. A little later there's the orange, which starts maybe here, and then it matches in the beginning, and then it goes a little low. The next green one goes a little high like that, so you can forecast like this. The measured level is the blue curve, and you may be able to see that it's dropping every now and then. This is actually because this particular reservoir, they measure the water level in the reservoir 5 meters away from a gate, which they open in the daytime for irrigation. And once they open the gate, the water level at the, they measure drops because of the outflow. But the whole lake doesn't drop like that. Right? So at night, when they close the gate, it goes back up to what the lake level actually is. Right? So it's actually wrong. The observed reservoir level is wrong because you get it at one point only. So we modeled only according to the upper, you can say the water level measured during the night. So what do you do? If you have a catchment area like this, and we have flood risk in this lower area, well, the flood may come from different parts of the catchment. If it's raining heavily up here in the far upstream, then it's going to take a while for the water to come down here, and then it may generate like a peak like this. But there's quite the time from the rain falls until the flooding occurs is relatively long. But if it rains around this catchment here, it goes much faster, and maybe you get this one, right? So the time from the rain until we can start doing something is the time available to collect this real-time data and transmit it. So you have these rain gauges and other gauges that collect and then transmit. Some are set to only send the data once an hour, even though maybe they measure every 10 minutes. But you can also transmit it immediately once it's there. Once the data is received, there is some processing and some automatic quality assurance. If it rains more than 1,000 millimeters per hour, it's probably wrong. Somebody poured water into the rain gauge. Right? So you can check for gross errors like that, or if the water level does like this, that can be detected. But minor errors or slowly developing errors, automatically you can't see those. Right? So they may come into the forecast system. Then the forecast model have to run. So of course, when you make models for flood forecasting, you design them to run as quickly as you can. And once that is done, transmission to the end users, to the people who are to take action or to be warned, needs to happen. There is some experiment at the moment on flash flood warnings, because you have some areas, typically mountainous areas, suddenly there's a heavy shower, half an hour later, local village, a few people, maybe a local villages are hit by a flood. You can't really forecast that. There are several systems that forecast the risk of flash flood, because you have maybe high soil moisture and now heavy showers are likely to occur. But actually forecasting that along this little stream, this is going to happen, is still very experimental. And probably the best chance is radar, if you have that. So radar monitoring, maybe some of the satellites. There are some satellites that transmit very quickly. Maybe they can also be used in remote areas, but it's on a research level still. So typically a flood forecasting system is set up for a given area, and the operators working with this will then see a screen like that where you have your catchment areas in different colors depending either on the rainfall measured recently or the runoff simulated from those. And then there are stations indicated in different colors that also indicate whether the forecast is normal, whether we're above a warning level or above a danger level. So you have this data coming in, typically a SCADA system, which is then automatically transmitting the data into the forecasting platform, the modeling tools, and result dissemination. The models being rainfall runoff and routing in 1D, and sometimes, or increasingly actually now also two-dimensional, so you can forecast in 2D. I think we get back to that. The real-time data is the rainfall, 15 to 60 minutes between measurements. Rainfall forecast up to 2 or 3 days ahead, and typically at an hourly time step. Radar, if available. River flows, again, hourly or better. Tide, if you have that, if the model goes down to the ocean. And then if you can get real-time information from the dams on what are their releases, because inside your catchment you typically have dams or other structures, And how do they operate these, or how do they plan to operate them in the coming future? Most of the forecasting systems we have made, that has not been possible. Setting that up and getting that information in real time has not really been possible. We can get their rules that under these conditions, this is what we're going to do. But time and again, you see that when the flood is actually there, they do something else. Right? So it's not so easy. Radar and short-term weather forecasting is often good if you can get a relation between the radar signal and the actual rainfall. One example here, where you can put in a line that sort of indicates some relation, but as you can see, it's not a very well-defined relation between the radar signal here. It varies across the world, and I think I mentioned before that all the radars I worked with in Malaysia when I was stationed there were useless. I mean, we just couldn't get any sense out of them, so we gave up. Numerical weather prediction local models are getting better in forecasting the rainfall. And this GPM, as I mentioned earlier, is quite promising, I think, but still we remain to see how good it actually is. So,
Sir, I would like to say that I am looking after this flood forecasting
yeah.
for all the rivers in India. We have developed all river models using your mic software, one hydro.
Right.
We are using this one GPM and DRM both
Okay.
for real-time data. And last in recent monsoon season, we have about 80% of it, more than 80% of it.
So, okay.
But problem is that we want to switch over to the inundation mode.
Yeah.
But your mic software will support or may not.
It will. I mean, we're running 2D flood mapping in real time several places now. Yeah.
That is not supporting that much.
Yes, it is. Not Mike 11, but my flood. My flood runs 2D in real time.
Because we have DM of about 0.5 meters.
Yeah. I think we might get back to it, but since you mentioned it now, for a long time the problem with 2D models still is to some extent, it takes a long time to calculate a flood map, because these 2D models, particularly if you go down, have very, very detailed DEM and you have all the grids just as detailed. It can take many, many hours, even days sometimes, to actually calculate a flood map. And if you're doing that, if that is supposed to be part of your forecast, it's no use, right? So the solution has for a long time been, what you do is you calculate a flood map for a 10-year flood and a 20-year flood and a 30, all these different floods. And then when you're forecasting a flood, you check, okay, this is a 45-year flood. I pull out the map corresponding to 40 and 50 year, and then I have a good idea of what will be inundated. The problem is that very often the flooding comes with breakup and embankment, and that doesn't break the same place as you thought.
The problem is there how to copy this 1D to inundation maps. We have the 1D results at several stations.
Yeah.
In terms of warning level and
You can, yeah, I mean, it's based on 1D, you can of course make assessment of to some extent of the inundation. And I think there is some inundation assessment tool inside Mike 11 also, but the best one is to use the 2D models. That's much more accurate. I think we're getting to that. Can we get back to that a little later?
The high flows which we are predicting as floods, so those high flows are coming from model or flood routing?
Both. So you have I mean, if you go back to this one, like here, for example, right? In a catchment like this, you'll have a rainfall runoff around this tributary, another one here, have a range of rainfall runoff models in here. And they will automatically feed inflow to the river, so there's a river model then transporting this down, right? And all the way along, rainfall runoff model is feeding additional water into this, right? So that's the way it works.
For the downstream areas, it is the routing model that
Routing.
Yeah.
yeah.
But but with inflow all the way. Right? Yeah. So if you look at a given forecast, you have the real-time data, gauge rainfall, radar maybe, water levels, flows, whatever is available up to now. Sometimes it's not actually up, this is in the timer forecast. It may not be all available up to now. So if let's say maybe the rainfall didn't come in and we only have up till 6 hours ago, well then we will start at this time 6 hours before with what the weather forecast was and use that instead as the estimate of the rainfall. And once of course we come into the future, which is after timer forecast, it's forecasted rainfall, maybe forecasted tide if you have the run into the ocean. And then you run it for in very large catchment up to 7 days. Typically it's 2-3 days into the future. And what happens then is another forecast comes a little later, maybe every 6 hours, a new forecast is run. Typically we set it up so that automatically this happens. You don't have to have people actually sitting there doing this. It just will automatically collect the data, run the model, and then update the results. We're using something called data assimilation for updating the model. Because sometimes you have, let's go back to a catchment here. If we take this catchment here, for example, we have maybe a rainfall runoff model in this area here, and there are very few rain gauges, maybe, or at least in real time. So still the rainfall runoff model runs, but what comes into this river may not be correct in the forecast. Then here is then a gauging station on the river, and there we might see that the simulation is generally lower than the measurements that we have had recently. Right? So this data assimilation will use this measured flow or water level to update so that it's matching up to the timer forecast, and then keep updating into the actual forecast period and getting much more accurate forecast. Particularly in a case like this where it obviously doesn't vary very quickly. In a more flashy river, it's more difficult to use this. But generally, this improves mainly the short-term forecast accuracy quite a lot. So if we look at a catchment in general, in the upstream part here at point A, if you want to make a forecast here, you'll have very little lead time. Because what happens here is once the rain occurs, it takes maybe an hour or so before it hits this area. And so to really forecast this, say 6 hours ahead, you need very, very accurate weather forecast. And we don't have that normally, right? We're hoping that the meteorologists will provide that at one time, but at the moment that's the way it is, right? So, so generally the forecast can be accurate only for maybe an hour or so, and otherwise the reliability is poor. If you move down to point B here, you have at least a moderate lead time. So here it's a
minimum lead time we can
forecast. The minimum is a second, right? The maximum is, I mean, we're running flood forecasting in Bangladesh, and I think they based on satellite-based rainfall in the whole Ganges-Brahmaputra, they have many days, right?
It's the maximum that is
so,
important.
So it's, yeah, you could say, but on this moderate one here, we do have routing, partly of course of what comes to A, but also what's coming in the upper part here. So here we have a better chance of making a reasonably reliable forecast, at least over several hours. And when we come down to the town here, a longer time. Rainfall runoff models, at least those 3, but maybe even subdivided further. And whenever there's a gauging station, updating the flow, so that, let's say if this is a gauging station, then here we make sure that it's updated up until the timer forecast, and therefore the time it takes from it to flow down here, that amount of water is at least correct, you could say. Then additional inflow might occur along the river still, but there's quite a good chance of getting a good accuracy in the downstream part compared to upstream. 2D models, as you were mentioning. So depending on site, you can actually use them to run them in real time. So when we're doing that, sometimes we use a A GPU, that's a graphical processor unit, which some computers have that in the screen. I think if you're playing computer games that take a lot of action, then you need some. They're quite expensive, but you probably know. But very fast, and they're good for two-dimensional models because this is also a grid, right? So with those you can speed up a lot the calculation time. The pre-cooked are the ones I mentioned before, that if you beforehand have made a range of flood maps for different probability, then if you forecast one, pull out a map and say this is likely what's going to happen. Right? Again, the problem is if it's like Kushi flood 2008, nobody expected that. The flow wasn't very high even. It just broke the embankment because of maintenance probably, and here it comes, right? So if you haven't foreseen exactly that the dike break, then you don't have that map. 2D maps are very good for visualization and assessing, of course, the impact. In real time, you can also, once you see it's going to move this way, which areas need to be evacuated first and so on. So that is often done. I can't remember whether I have slides on that, but getting back to your flood mapping, the traditional two-dimensional models are calculating in the grid. So you have lines with same distance like this and same distance like that, and in each grid point you calculate water level and then flow between them, right? So that's the way it's done. Now we are increasingly using what's called a flexible mesh. So you have in your floodplains you have a few points here and there connected by lines, so like spider lines that directly between these. When you then come close to an area where maybe there's an embankment, then you have several points up the embankment. So then it's a very dense network, so they're describing the topography. But if the topography doesn't change, you don't need all these grids, right? You have points here and there, assuming that it's horizontal between, which it also is. So this means that your number of calculation points are much less, and then it's much faster, right? I'll see, maybe I can show some examples.
The automatic or you have to do manual?
We have a mesh generator, so you can, based on the topography, you can generate the mesh more or less automatically.
So in SRS we are generating this one manually.
Yeah, but we have tools for that. Bangladesh, since '88 we've actually operated. That's not right. I think we started in '88 setting it up, but anyway, forecasting a flood forecasting system which is still running in Bangladesh, based on this our Mike 11, covering the entire country with real-time data, and this is forecasting 96 hours in advance, utilizing global weather models also. Very reliable. There was a lot of capacity building in training local people, but once they got it, you could say, then they have continued without us for all this time. India. So Damodar Valley was the first one we set up here in 1985. And in those days, I mean, the basic models were the same. NAM and what we call System 11 was there at the time. Of course, in the earlier versions, and they have been improved, but the basic calculations are still the same. So in this catchment, I think we had divided it in 14 sub-catchments up till Maitan and Panchit reservoirs here. This was selected when we started with Central Water Commission back in '82 as a key area for a case study area, because in 1978 there had been a very bad flood downstream. I think 2,000 people died. What happened was that suddenly the inflow to Maitan, Panchit reservoir just increased, and nobody had seen it coming, and they were already quite full. So they couldn't do anything but open the gates, and disaster occurred. Central Water Commission then decided not to fill the dams anymore. So they were only to about half volume from 78 onwards. And still in 85, when we were out there, they were operated like this, so there was a big flood cushion. Right? There are 3 other reservoirs upstream, Chilaya, Kona, and Tenugat is here. And at least in those days, Tenugat is in another state. I think it was West Bengal here and Bihar. So getting information from Tenugat was very difficult, actually. Anyway, this took a long time to make the models. We have 3 people from Central Water Commission in Denmark for 6 months working with the data and modeling and training and so on. Right? And then during the monsoon 85, I was also there in Meitzen working with these people, setting this up in real time. And we were doing that on a computer that Wipro has produced. And it was quite brand new, and they had written the operating system and the compilers and everything themselves, not imported anything. And it was so full of errors. I mean, and the only error message was fatal error. So when we were programming anything, fatal errors. Then you would put in the right statement, now I'm here in this program, now I'm here to find out where this fatal error occurred. And finding it sometimes, but occasionally also, suddenly it would work. And we hadn't done anything, we just put in this right statement. Okay, then we took out the right statement, then it didn't work anymore. So then instead of right statement, we just put some dummy statements, and then it was working. I mean, it was really horrible. But somebody from Wipro came up every Saturday with a tape with a new compiler, and then they got a long list of new errors to bring back, and we did that for. So we were beta testing their software. Anyway, we started running the inflow forecasting, and in those days, this wasn't very automatic. So what happened was that we came in the morning, 9:30, 10 or so, and then AK Das, who was living there in Meitzen and working from Central Water Commission, he would then get on the radio, and then he would call the guy who had the rain gauge up here. Sometimes it took a while to get through, but on the radio, and then, okay, so what did you measure of rainfall, and what is the level of the river, and go through all the stations like that. Once we had that, we typed them in, and then we started. And you saw the NAM model we did 2,000 calculations in a few seconds, right? In those days, you could see the time step, 1, 2, 3, 4, I mean, this is really something else. So by lunchtime, we had the forecast. And the main forecast they wanted was, what is the volume of inflow over the next 24 hours? But the next 24 hours starting at 8 o'clock, and now it was 1 o'clock, right? So, but still, that was the volume was there. And in the beginning, it wasn't that very good. First, we then found a few possibilities of improving it, but the best idea came from this AK Das, because we noticed that once the forecast was ready, we were already 5 hours into the forecast period. So the weather forecast had been used as rainfall rather than measured rainfall already, right? And made a big difference there. So getting accurate weather forecast was important, and IMD data was useless in those days. So what he did, AK Das, was that he then, when he had them on the phone, he said, is it raining now? Is it raining heavily? When do you think it will stop? Or it doesn't rain, do you think it will rain later? You know, what is your feeling? Huh? And based on that, he said, okay, 5 millimeters. So, no, you know, like that. And then he keeps track. When Kumar said it's going to rain, maybe it doesn't, right? But Agarwal, he's a better feeling. So he calibrated the people even, right? And that improved a lot, actually, the results. So after a while, it was very good what we were getting. I then left in September. I went trekking in Nepal, but then they continued doing that, and I think I have that. Yeah, in October '85, this peak was forecasted, inflow to Meitzen. So the inflow was about maybe less than 100 or so, about 100 cubic meters per second, but rising here during one day to about 2,500, and then falling again. So this is over 3 days or so. And what we see here are the daily forecast, and then what actually happened. And being mid-October, that was likely to be the last peak in the monsoon. So the director, the local superintending engineer of Central Water Commission, when this was forecasted, he said, okay, we keep the gates closed, we fill the reservoir, which they did. People were calling in, sir, the reservoir is rising. Yes, we know, uncontrolled, right? So both Panchit and Meitzen was actually filled to full capacity with these two. And this is in 1986. This is statistics of what was forecasted in volume and what came. So very nicely, so it worked really well. And This model is actually still running. Now it's DVC running it, and of course updated version and so on. But probably the longest, this is even longer I think than Bangladesh, of active models. Okay, so yeah, this is a later, for the same area, later version. Krishna, a forecasting system was set up which is quite similar, but of course the new one. And this one is, for Krishna Bhima, is running with all the reservoirs also. So a major purpose of this is to forecast inflow to reservoir and help them operate the reservoirs in real time. I can't remember how many, but lots of reservoirs are in this part. Same one. Yeah, including the one we talked about yesterday, this Karaguasla near Pune city. Bagrabeas is also a system running, not so much flood forecasting, but more the inflow to the reservoirs for the operation. And one of the challenging things here is that much of the catchment is in China. So again, it's satellite information. Snow modeling is important and so on. So, an experimental one has been set up here. I don't think it's operational for all of Brahmaputra also by DHI India recently. In Thailand, they had this very bad flood in 2011, as I mentioned. So after that, they called us to help them set up forecasting for this Chao Phraya, which is here. And when that was done, we went to the Chimun Basin and then other parts of. So this has continued ever since then. But forecasting is not the only thing. Oh, we're forgetting tea, are we? I talk too much. We have time, okay. Forecasting is not enough. You need to get the warnings out. And actually, the flood forecasting systems being set up at the moment are around the world are often what they call end-to-end flood forecasting and warning systems. So you take it all the way, including considering how do you warn, who are warned, are they ready to take the right action when the warning comes and so on, right? So getting them out, while radio, TV, internet, of course, much is automated. The forecasting systems that we run can automatically send an SMS or send an email to different people. And many of the systems will then, or the local authorities owning them, they don't want the system to send it directly to people. They want them, so first it's sent to the operator. And that may be Saturday night, he's sitting back home, then his phone goes beep, okay, there's a warning. He logs on from home and can then see what is the forecast. Because again, if somebody had poured a liter of water into a rain gauge and then all the bells go, right? You don't want people to start evacuating, right? So he checks this forecast seems reasonable, pushes a button, and then it goes automatically to whoever needs to take action, right? So some websites here in UK, flood warning, where you can go and see where flooding might occur. Similar in the US, where background information and so on are being...
Sir,
yeah?
One thing I would like to share also. We have also started an online portal for this flood forecasting 24/7 from last year.
Yeah.
So we can share inform also.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's all over, yeah. So it's running automatically. Yeah, yeah. That's good. But of course, you need also to be prepared for it, right? So to have the high level of preparedness and need to know what to do, evacuation routes and so on. If you have to evacuate people, which way should you go? And based on flood maps, you can of course plan them beforehand. But if the flood map hasn't been made according to the flood that occurs now, again, maybe a break in the embankment somewhere that you haven't foreseen, then having real-time two-dimensional simulation of what's going to happen is very useful. So a lot of information, many countries are also doing this, that's increasing the awareness as such, so that people are also aware. Many will be already. I mean, many people live with floods, so they know it's coming. But they don't live with the extreme floods, right? So knowing how extreme it might be can be very useful, right? Seeing flood maps and so on public websites maybe and so be aware, make a plan, stay informed, know where to go, and like that. Have emergency kits. So a lot of things you can do. Turn off electricity, gas, and water, like that. There's one in Australia. The Victoria State made this advertisement at one point. So broken glass, raw sewage, trees, decaying animals, chemical waste, deadly debris. That was a car, I think. Never swim, play, or dive in flood water. You don't know what you're getting into. Yeah. But making plans in general in communities is we see increasingly around the world, and often based on model results, floodplains, and so on. That is what I had here. You think we should say, yeah, okay, we'll do that. Maybe if you want some more tomorrow, we'll look at some flood mapping. Okay.
I have a question though. See, flood forecasting is all very fine, but you see, you already know that Brahmaputra is a very mighty river, and every year we have floods. The recurrence interval is almost 1 year. So, are there any studies that have been conducted to suggest structural measures to reduce the damage which is caused every year by this?
Yeah.
Because the structural measures are also very important. Because just forecasting and letting people know that it will be flooding is not helping them too much actually.
Yeah. No, it's all these.
Is the government of India, maybe CWC people might be knowing, are they looking at some wider plan
For which river?
for Brahmaputra? Because structural measures, for example, what I was thinking is, if we can have dikes on both sides of the river, RCC walls, maybe in stages, because already we are spending too much money, but I don't know where the money is going. So, in steps, in stages, maybe have dikes on both sides of the river. Although it's not an easy project, but this is the way forward. This is what I feel. Dr. Sanjay, what do you think? Is it possible?
But structural measures has to be looked into the topography and the behavior of the river.
Yeah. No, the river is, they change its course very easily. In Assam and in northeastern states, there is devastation almost every year. And we are very pained to see that nothing is being done, nothing concrete is being done.
So one high-level committee has been constituted.
The committee and there are people who don't know.
The scientific consultant also.
And they never take on board the people who would be able to give some suggestions. Those people are not taken on board. I don't know what committee does.
Situation problem. There's big river islands, and because of that, it floods. So whenever you stop that, it is not possible. Because before entering to
We
India,
are not trying to stop the flow, only trying to maintain a course, some course. How would topography would not be an issue if we just want to construct dikes on both sides? Many rivers in USA, they have a well-defined course. On both sides of the river, there are dikes. Although the rivers are not as mighty as ours.
No. But then you also see, I mean,
but is it all throughout the course of the river, throughout the length?
no. I mean, if you look at the experience around the world, in China they put dikes along the Yellow River, and then it's sedimented between the embankments. So it started coming up, then they raised the dikes, and then it started coming up, and then they raised the dikes. So after a while, you had people down here, and you had the river up there, right?
The problem is
same problem is with Brahmaputra, siltation.
And I mean, in Bangladesh, they have bridges across these huge rivers that they have down there, and it's very, very difficult to.
During times of floods, the silt which is deposited is normally washed away.
I mean, you can calculate that. You can even model the sediment transport and see whether that happens. But you can also see that like in this Yellow River, even floods don't help much. Not enough.
Here in irrigation departments, we spend a lot of money on desilting, removing the silt. If you calculate the amount of money that is being spent, he's from irrigation department, you know. He is an executive engineer there.
Of course,
It's a big problem.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
there can be a check like.
Yeah,
it
but-
has to be removed.
But there are these three measures overall. There is the upstream prevention that retains water, there's local protection if that's possible, and then there's the preparedness on forecast. And it's typically it's a combination of these things that's the best. We still have the flood and drought portal introduction, but I actually suggest we break for tea,
Yeah.
and then we come back here, and then I give you a brief introduction, and then we go and do the exercise the rest of the day.